All right. Hello and welcome to the Marxist Reading Community channel. Um, Today we're going to take a second try at last week's failure at reading through Fredrick Engel's Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Sorry about the issues last week. Hopefully this week we'll have better luck and we won't run into as many streaming issues. And we'll get to read the first volume of Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. And um, yeah, I think it's worth mentioning that this is uh, probably one of the best um, probably one of the best starting points for anyone who's uh, not really familiar with what socialism is or what it's all about, because it gives a great introduction to what um, what socialism is and why it makes sense. Um, I think it takes some I think you sort of have to open up to it though, because it's written um, from the perspective of someone who expects people to have a certain perspective that has been taken out of ordinary society. And I think by the end of it, you gain the perspective that it expected you to have. Funny enough. So it's an interesting dynamic that you develop with the text, because it gives you the perspective that you need in order to fully grasp the the weight of the um, the weight of what it's trying to tell you. So I've I've been meaning to revisit this, so this will be actually uh, a very fun experience for me to get to read this again. Um, in fact, last week when we were starting to read it, I was enjoying it because of that reason, because it is a better read the second time, um, having that perspective um, of knowing what the author was trying to or was getting at right from the beginning, rather than needing to develop a certain perspective. Um, and uh, that perspective, I guess, to try to clue you in so that you have a bit of that understanding from the beginning, is he's writing this, um, trying to elucidate the development of uh, the class system in society and how that class system came to be. So that's sort of where he starts out. So how did classes develop? Where did this whole system of there being a working class, which he refers to as the proletarian class, and the bourgeois class being the class of the elites. How did that come to be? How did those classes come to exist? Because it didn't spur from nowhere. It's not something that sort of just always existed. If you grew up on, Saturday morning cartoons and watched the Flintstones and the Jetsons, you would think that they always existed and were always going to exist for the rest of time. But that's not how the world works. Um, and this is the perfect book to shine a light on the fact that definitely not the way that it has always been and will always be. That is a great portion of what Marx and Engels dedicated their lives to trying to understand. And this book is in large part um, a dedication to trying to um, dedicate their well, Engels specifically dedicate his um, uh, or put into a thesis of why there used to be this conception of socialism as this criticism of capitalism and a yearning for a better system to exist, but not really knowing how or why that could be possible. It was sort of a pipe dream. Um, and then it concludes by explaining how the contributions of Marx and Engels um, to to the ideas of socialism made it what is now known as scientific socialism, uh, because they grounded it in material reality and gave it a scientific basis on observable facts that can be observed, proven, and understood, and uh, gave it a character that can be observed, proven, and understood. So, on that basis, you go from a utopian socialism that is a pipe dream to a scientific socialism that you can you can put forward an idea and say, well, this isn't something that you have to take on faith. I can make this assertion and tell you that you will see this through your own experience, that these conditions will happen to you based on your own life experience. And as we will see, these experiences are going to ring true to experiences that are not unlike things that we have already seen happen in our own lifetimes. So, I think hopefully that should give a good enough introduction to some of what we'll cover in today's, well, not today's. We won't get to the stuff that's relevant to us today, but we'll definitely cover that as we get uh, through the text. But today we'll get through some interesting history. Um, so without further ado, let's get to it. So we're covering volume one of Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, and this is on the development of utopian socialism. Just so that I don't sound too horrible. All right. Modern socialism is, in its essence, the direct product of the recognition, on the one hand, of the class antagonisms existing in the society of today between proprietors and non-proprietors, between capitalists and wage workers, on the other hand, of the anarchy existing in production. But in its theoretical form, modern socialism originally appears ostensibly as a more logical extension of the principles laid down by the great French philosophers of the 18th century. Like every new theory, modern socialism had, at first, to connect itself with the intellectual stock in trade ready to its hand, however deeply its roots lay in material economic facts. The great men who in France prepared men's minds for the coming revolution were themselves extreme revolutionists. It recognized no external authority of any kind whatever. Religion, natural science, society, political institutions, everything was subjected to the most unsparing criticism. Everything must justify its existence before the judgment seat of reason or give up its existence. Reason became the sole measure of everything. It was the time when, as Hegel says, the world stood upon its head, first in the sense of the human head, and the principles arrived at by its thought claimed to be the basis of all human action and association, but by and by also in the wider sense that the reality which was in contradiction to these principles had, in fact, to be turned upside down. Every form of society and government then existing, every old traditional notion, was flung into the lumber room as irrational. The world had hitherto allowed itself to be led solely by prejudices. Everything in the past deserved only pity and contempt. Now, for the first time, appeared the light of day, the kingdom of reason. Henceforth superstition, injustice, privilege, oppression were to be superseded by eternal truth, eternal right, equality based on nature, and the inalienable rights of man. We know today that this kingdom of reason was nothing more than the idealized kingdom of the bourgeoisie, that this eternal right found its realization in bourgeois justice, that this equality reduced itself to bourgeois equality before the law, that bourgeois property was proclaimed as one of the essential rights of man, and that the government of reason, the contrat social of Rousseau, came into being and only could come into being as a democratic bourgeois republic. The great thinkers of the 18th century could, no more than their predecessors, go beyond the limits imposed upon them by their epoch. But, side by side with the antagonisms of the feudal nobility of the bourgeois, who claimed to represent all of the rest of society, was the general antagonism of exploiters and exploited, of rich idlers and poor workers. It was this very circumstance that made it possible for the representatives of the bourgeoisie to put themselves forward as representing not only one special class, but the whole of suffering humanity. Still further, from its origin, the bourgeoisie was saddled with its antithesis. Capitalists cannot exist without wage workers, and in the same proportion as the medieval burgher of the guild developed into the modern bourgeois, the guild journeyman and the day laborer outside the guilds developed into the proletarian. And although, upon the whole, the bourgeoisie, in their struggle with the nobility, could claim to represent at the same time the interests of the different working classes of that period, yet in every great bourgeois movement there were independent outbursts of that class which was the forerunner, more or less developed, of the modern proletariat. For example, in the time of the German Reformation and the Peasants' War, the Anabaptists and Thomas Munzer in the Great English Revolution, the Levelers in the Great French Revolution, Babeuf. These were theoretical enunciations, corresponding with these revolutionary uprisings of a class not yet developed in the 16th and 17th centuries, utopian pictures of ideal social conditions, in the 18th century, actual communistic theories. The demand for equality was no longer limited to political rights. It was extended also to the social conditions of individuals. It was not simply class privileges that were to be abolished, but but class distinctions themselves. A communism, ascetic, denouncing all the pleasures of life, Spartan, was the first form of the new teaching. Then came the three great utopians. Saint Simon, to whom the middle class movement, side by side with the proletarian, still had a certain significance, Fourier and Owen, who in the country where capitalist production was most developed, and under the influence of the antagonisms begotten of this, worked out his proposals for the removal of class distinction systematically and in direct relation to French materialism. One thing is common to all three. Not one of them appears as a representative of the interests of the proletariat, which historical development had, in the meantime, produced. Like the French philosophers, they do not claim to emancipate a particular class to begin with, but all humanity at once. Like them, they wish to bring in the kingdom of reason and eternal justice, but this kingdom, as they see it, is as far as heaven from earth from that of French philosophers. For, to our three social reformers, the bourgeois world, based upon the principles of these philosophers, is quite as irrational and unjust, and therefore finds its way to the dust hole quite as readily as feudalism and all the earlier stages of society. If pure reason and justice have not hitherto ruled the world, this has been the case only because men have not rightly understood them. What was wanted was the individual man of genius who has now arisen and who understands the truth. That he has now arisen, that the truth has now been clearly understood, is not an inevitable event, following of necessity in the chains of historical development, but a mere happy accident. He might just as well have been born 500 years earlier, and might then have spared humanity 500 years of error, strife, and suffering. We saw how the French philosophers of the 18th century, the forerunners of the Revolution, appeared to reason as the sole judge of all that is. A rational government, rational society, were to be founded. Everything that ran counter to eternal reason was to be remorselessly done away with. We saw also that this eternal reason was in reality nothing but an idealized understanding of the 18th century citizen, just then evolving into the bourgeois. The French Revolution had realized this rational society and government. But the new order of things, rational enough as compared to earlier conditions, turned out to be by no means absolutely rational. The state based upon reason completely collapsed. Rousseau's Contrat social had found its realization in the Reign of Terror, from which the bourgeoisie, who had lost confidence in their own political capacity, had taken refuge first in the corruption of the dictatorate, and finally under the wing of the Napoleonic despotism. The promised eternal peace was turned into an endless war of conquest. The society based upon reason had fared no better. The antagonism between rich and poor, instead of dissolving into general prosperity, had become intensified by the removal of the guild and other privileges, which had to some extent bridged it over, and by the removal of the charitable institution of the church. The freedom of property, the quote, freedom of property, to properly contextualize it for you guys, the quote, freedom of property from feudal fetters, now veritably accomplished, turned out to be, for the small capitalists and small proprietors, the freedom to sell their small property, crushed under the overmastering competition of the large capitalists and landlords, to the great lords, and thus, as far as the small capitalist and peasant proprietors were concerned, became freedom from property. The development of industry upon a capitalistic basis made poverty and misery of the working masses conditions of existence of society. Cash payment became more and more, in Carlyle's phrase, the sole nexus between man and man. The number of crimes increased from year to year. Formerly, the feudal vices had openly stalked about in broad daylight. Though not eradicated, they were now, at any rate, thrust into the background. In their stead, the bourgeois vices, hitherto practiced in secret, began to blossom all the more luxuriantly. Trade became a greater and greater extent cheating. Trade became to a greater and greater extent cheating. The fraternity of the revolutionary motto was realized in the chicanery and rivalries of the battle of competition. Oppression by force was replaced by corruption, the sword, as the first social lever, by gold. The right of the first knight was transferred from the feudal lords to the bourgeois manufacturers. Prostitution increased to an extent never heard of. Marriage itself remained, as before, the legally recognized form, the official cloak of prostitution, and moreover, was supplemented by rich crops of adultery. In a word, compared with the splendid promises of the philosophers, the social and political institutions born of the triumph of reason were bitterly disappointing caricatures. All that was wanting was that the men to formulate this disappointment, and they came with the turn of the century. In 1802, St. Simon's Geneva Letters appeared. In 1808 appeared Fourier's first work, although the groundwork of his theory dated from 1799. On January 1st, 1800, Robert Owen undertook the direction of New Lanark. At this time, however, the capitalist mode of production, and with it the antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, was still very incompletely developed. Modern industry, which had just arisen in England, was still unknown in France. But modern industry develops, on the one hand, the conflicts which make absolutely necessary a revolution in the mode of production, and the doing away with the capitalistic character. Conflicts not only between the classes begotten of it, but also between the very productive forces and the forms of exchange created by it. And on the other hand, it develops, in these very gigantic productive forces, the means of ending these conflicts. If, therefore, about the year 1800, the conflicts arising from the new social order were only just beginning to take shape, this holds still more fully as to the means of ending them. The, quote, have nothing masses of Paris during the Reign of Terror were able for a moment to gain the mastery, and thus to lead the bourgeois revolution to victory in spite of the bourgeoisie themselves. But in doing so, they only proved how impossible it was for their domination to last under the conditions then obtaining. The proletariat, which then for the first time evolved itself from these, quote, have-nothing masses as the nucleus of the new class, as yet quite incapable of independent political action, appeared as an oppressed, suffering order, to whom, in its incapacity to help itself, help could, at best, be brought in from without or down from above. This historical situation also dominated the founders of socialism. To the crude conditions of capitalistic production and the crude class conditions correspond crude theories. The solution of the social problems which as yet lay hidden in undeveloped economic conditions, the Utopians attempted to evolve out of the human brain. Society presented nothing but wrongs. To remove these was the task of reason. It was necessary then to discover a new and more perfect system of social order, and to impose this upon society from without by propaganda and, whenever it was possible, by the example of model experiments. These new social systems were foredoomed as utopian. The more completely they were worked out in detail, the more they could not avoid drifting off into pure fantasies. These facts once established, we need not dwell a moment longer upon this side of the question, now wholly belonging to the past. We can leave it to the literary small fry of solemnly quibble over the fantasies which today only make us smile, and to crow over the superiority of their own bald reasoning, as compared with such insanity. For ourselves, we delight in the stupendously grand thoughts and germs of thought that everywhere break out through their fantastic covering, and to which these Philistines are blind. Saint Simon was a son of the great French Revolution, at the outbreak of which he was not yet 30. The Revolution was the victory of the Third Estate, i.e., of the great masses of the nation working in production and in trade, over the privileged idle classes, the nobles and the priests. But the victory of the Third Estate soon revealed itself as exclusively the victory of a smaller part of this estate, as the conquest of political power by the socially privileged section of it, i.e., the propertied bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie had certainly developed rapidly during the Revolution, partly by speculation of the lands of the nobility and of the church, confiscated and afterwards put up for sale, and partly by frauds upon the nation by means of army contracts. It was the domination of these swindlers that, under the Dictatorate, brought France to the verge of ruin, and thus gave Napoleon the pretext for his coup d'etat. Hence, to Saint Simon, the antagonism between the Third Estate and the privileged classes took the form of an antagonism between the workers and idlers. The idlers were not merely the old privileged classes, but also all who, without taking any part in production or distribution, lived on their incomes. And the workers were not only the wage workers, but also the manufacturers, the merchants, the bankers. That the idlers had lost the capacity for intellectual leadership and political supremacy had been proved, and it was by the Revolution finally settled. That the non-possessing classes had not this capacity seemed to Saint Simon proved by the experiences of the Reign of Terror. Then who was to lead the command? According to Saint Simon, science and industry, both united by a new religious bond destined to restore that unity of religious ideas which had been lost since the time of the Reformation, a necessarily mystic and rigidly hierarchic new Christianity. But science, that was the scholars, and industry, that was, in the first place, the working bourgeois, manufacturers, merchants, bankers. These bourgeois were certainly intended by Saint Simon to transform themselves into a kind of public officials, of social trustees, but they were still to hold vis-a-vis of the workers a commanding and economically privileged position. The bankers especially were to be called upon to direct the whole of social production by the regulation of credit. This conception was in exact keeping with a time in which modern industry in France, and with it the chasm between bourgeoisie and proletariat, was only just coming into existence. And what Saint Simon especially lays stress upon is this, that what interests him first, and above all other things, is the lot of the class that is the most numerous and the most poor. Already in his Geneva letters, St. Simon lays down the proposition that all men ought to work. In the same work, he recognizes also that the reign of terror was the reign of the non-possessing masses. See, he says, quote, see, unquote, he says to them, quote, what happened in France at the time when your comrades held sway there? They brought about a famine, unquote. But to recognize the French Revolution as a class war, and not simply one between nobility and bourgeoisie, but between nobility, bourgeoisie, and the non-possessors, was, in the year 1802, a most pregnant discovery. In 1816, he declares that politics is the science of production and foretells the complete absorption of politics by economics. The knowledge that economic conditions are the basis of political institutions appears here only in embryo. Yet what is here already very plainly expressed in the idea of the future conversion of political rule over men into an administration of things and a direction of process of production. That is to say, the abolition of the state, about which recently there has been so much noise. Saint Simon shows the same superiority over his contemporaries, when in 1814, immediately after the entry of the Allies into Paris, and again in 1815 during the Hundred Days' War, he proclaims the alliance of France and England, and then of both of these countries with Germany, as the only guarantee for the prosperous development and peace of Europe. To preach to the French in 1815 an alliance with the victors of Waterloo required as much courage as historical foresight. If in St. Simon we find a comprehensive breadth of view, by virtue of which almost all the ideas of later socialists that are not strictly economic are found in him in embryo, we find in Fourier a criticism of the existing conditions of society, genuinely French and witty, but not upon that account any the less thorough. Fourier takes the bourgeoisie, their inspired prophets before the Revolution, and their interested eulogists after it, at their own word. He lays bare remorselessly the material and moral misery of the bourgeois world. He confronts it with the earlier philosophers' dazzling promises of a society in which reason alone should reign, of a civilization in which happiness should be universal, of an illimitable human perfectibility, and with the rose-colored phraseology of the bourgeois ideologists of his time. He points out how everywhere the most pitiful reality corresponds with the most high-sounding phrases, and he overwhelms this hopeless fiasco of phrases with his mordant sarcasm. Fourier is not only a critic, his imperturbably serene nature makes him a satirist, and assuredly one of the greatest satirists of all time. He depicts, with equal power and charm, the swindling speculations that blossomed out upon the downfall of the Revolution, and the shopkeeping spirit prevalent in and characteristic of French commerce at the time. Still more masterly is his criticism of the bourgeois form of the relations between sexes, and the position of women in bourgeois society. He was the first to declare that in any given society, the degree of women's emancipation is the natural measure of the general emancipation. But Fourier is at his greatest in his conception of the history of society. He divides its whole course, thus far, into four stages of evolution: savagery, barbarism, the, the patriarchy, civilization. This last is identical with the so-called civil or bourgeois society of today, i.e., with the social order that came in with the 16th century. He proves, quote, that the civilized stage raises every vice practiced by barbarism in a simple fashion into a form of existence, complex, ambiguous, equivocal, hypocritical, unquote. That civilization moves, quote, in a vicious circle, unquote, in contradictions which it constantly reproduces without being able to solve them. Hence, it constantly arrives at the very opposite to that which it wants to attain, or pretends to want to attain, so that, for example, quote, under civilization, property is born of subabundance itself. Fourier, as we see, uses the dialectic method in the same masterly way as his contemporary Hegel. Using these same dialectics, he argues against talk about illimitable human perfectibility, that every historical phase has its period of ascent and also its period of descent, and he applies this observation to the future of the whole human race. As Kant introduced into natural science the idea of the ultimate destruction of the earth, Fourier introduced into historical science that of the ultimate destruction of the human race. Whilst in France, the hurricane of the Revolution swept over the land. In England, a quieter, but not on that account less tremendous, revolution was going on. Steam and the new tool-making machinery were transforming manufacture into modern industry, and thus revolutionizing the whole foundation of bourgeois society. The sluggish march of development of the manufacturing period changed into a veritable storm and stress period of production, with constantly increasing swiftness. The splitting up into large capitalist and non-possessing proletarians went on. Between these, instead of the former stable middle class and unstable mass of artisans and small shopkeepers, the most fluctuating portion of the population now led a precarious existence. The new mode of production was, as yet, only at the beginning of its period of ascent. As yet it was the normal, regular method of production, the only one possible under existing conditions. Nevertheless, even then it was producing crying social abuses, the herding together of a homeless population in the worst quarters of the large towns, the loosening of all traditional moral bonds, of patriarchal subordination, of family relations, overwork, especially of women and children, to a frightful extent, complete demoralization of the working class, suddenly flung into altogether new conditions, from the country into the town, from agriculture into modern industry, from stable conditions of existence into insecure ones that change from day to day. At this juncture, there came forward as a reformer, a manufacturer, 29-year-old, a man of almost sublime childlike simplicity of character, and at the same time one of the few born leaders of men. Robert Owen had adopted the teaching of the materialistic philosophers. that man's character is the product, on the one hand, of heredity, on the other, of the environment of the individual during his lifetime, and especially during his period of development. In the Industrial Revolution, most of his class saw only chaos and confusion, and the opportunity of fishing in these troubled waters and making large fortunes quickly. He saw in it the opportunity of putting into practice his favorite theory, and so of bringing order out of chaos. He had already tried it with success as superintendent of more than 500 men in a Manchester factory. From 1800 to 1829, he directed the great cotton mill at New Lanark in Scotland as managing partner along the same lines, but with greater freedom of action and with a success that made him a European reputation. A population originally consisting of the most diverse and, for the most part, very demoralized elements, a population that gradually grew to 2,500, he turned into a model colony in which drunkenness, police, magistrates, lawsuits, poor laws, charity were unknown. And all this simply by placing the people in conditions worthy of human beings, and especially by carefully bringing up the raising generation. He was the founder of infant schools, and introduced them first at New Lanark. At the age of 2, the children came to school, where they enjoyed themselves so much that they could scarcely be got home again, whilst his competitors worked their people 13 or 14 hours a day. In New Lanark, the working day was only 10.5 hours. When a crisis in cotton shop stopped work for 4 months, his workers received their full wages all the time, and with all this the business more than doubled in value, and to the last yielded large profits to its proprietors. In spite of all of this, Owen was not content. The existence which he secured for his workers was, in his eyes, still far from being worthy of human beings. Quote, "The people were slaves at my mercy." Unquote. The relatively favorable conditions in which he had placed them were still far from allowing a rational development of the character and of the intellect of all directions, much less of the free exercise of all their faculties. Quote, "And yet the working part of the population of 2,500 persons was daily producing as much real wealth for society as less than half a century before it would have required the working part of a population of 600,000 to create. I asked myself, what became of the difference between the wealth consumed by 2,500 persons and that which would have been consumed by 600,000? Unquote. The answer was clear. It had been used to pay the proprietors of the establishment 5% of the capital they had been laid out, in addition to over £300,000 clear profit, and that which held for New Lanark held to a still greater extent for all the factories in England. Quote, "If this new wealth had not been created by machinery, imperfectly as it has been applied, the wars of Europe, in opposition to Napoleon and to support the aristocratic principles of society, could not have been maintained. And yet this new power was the creation of the working classes." Unquote. To them, therefore, the fruits of this new power belonged. The newly created gigantic productive forces, hitherto used only to enrich individuals and to enslave the masses, offered to Owen the foundations for a reconstruction of society. They were destined as the common property of all to be worked for the common good of all. Owen's communism was based upon this purely business foundation, the outcome, so to say, of commercial calculation. Throughout, it maintained this practical character. Thus, in 1823, Owen proposed the relief of the distress in Ireland by communist colonies and drew up complete estimates of costs of founding them, clear yearly expenditure, and probable revenue, and his definite plan for the future, the technical working out of details managed with such practical knowledge, ground plan, front and side, and bird's eye views all included, that the Owen method of social reform once accepted, there is from the practical point of view little to be said against the actual arrangement of details. His advance of the direction of communism was the turning point in Owen's life. As long as he was simply a philanthropist, he was rewarded with nothing but wealth, applause, honor, and glory. He was the most popular man in Europe. Not only men of his own class, but statesmen and princes listened to him approvingly. But when he came out with his communist theories, that was quite another thing. Three great obstacles seemed to him especially to block the path of social reform: private property, religion, and the present form of marriage. He knew what confronted him if he attacked these: outlawry, excommunication from official society, the loss of his whole social position. But nothing of this prevented him from attacking them without fear of consequences. And what he had foreseen happened. Banished from society with a conspiracy of silence against him in the press, ruined by his unsuccessful communist experiments in America, in which he sacrificed all his fortune, he turned directly to the working class and continued working in their midst for 30 years. Every social movement, every real advance in England on behalf of the workers links itself on the name of Robert Owen. He forced through 1819, after 5 years' fighting, the first law limiting the hours of labor of women and children in factories. He was president of the first Congress in which all of the trade unions of England united in a single great trade association. He introduced as transition measures to the complete communistic organization of society, on the one hand, cooperative societies for retail trade and production. These laws have since that time at least given practical proof that the merchant and manufacturer are socially quite unnecessary. On the other hand, he introduced labor bazaars for the exchange of the products of labor through the medium of labor notes, whose unit was a single hour of work. Institutions necessarily doomed to failure, but completely anticipating Proudhon's bank exchange of a much later period, and differing entirely from this in that it did not claim to be the panacea of all social ills, but only a first step toward a much more radical revolution of society. The utopian's mode of thought has for a long time governed the socialist ideas of the 19th century and still governs some of them. Until very recently, all French and English socialists did homage to it. The earlier German communism, including that of Weitling, was of the same school. To all these, socialism is the expression of absolute truth, reason, and justice, and has only to be discovered to conquer all the world by virtue of its own power. And as an absolute truth is independent of time, space, and of the historical development of man, It is a mere accident when and where it is discovered. With all this, absolute truth, reason, and justice are different with the founder of each different school, and as each one's special kind of absolute truth, reason, and justice is again conditioned by its subjective understanding, his conditions of existence, the measure of his knowledge, and the intellectual training. There is no other ending possible of this conflict of absolute truths than that they shall be mutually exclusive of one another. Hence, from this nothing could come but a kind of eclectic average socialism, which, as a matter of fact, has up to the present time dominated the minds of most of the socialist workers in France and England. Hence, a mishmash, allowing of the most manifold shades of opinion, a mishmash of such critical statements, economic theories, pictures of future society by the founders of different sects as excite a minimum of opposition, a mishmash which is the more easily brewed, the more definite sharp edges of the individual constituents are rubbed down in the steam of debate, like rounded pebbles in a brook. To make science of socialism, it had first to be placed on a real basis. And that is volume one. Uh, yeah. So clearly he's giving a bit of a layup to the next chapter, which is going to be the scientific basis or the real basis on which scientific socialism is grounded on. And we'll see that next week. But we've already seen it. I mean, that's what we were looking at uh, before we started reading this. You know, it's the philosophical basis on which Marxism is grounded on. It's materialism, uh, and then it's dialectical materialism and historical materialism. It's understanding things on a materialist basis. And if you understand things on a materialist basis, then you are looking at reality as it exists, as it truly exists, not as you wish it to exist, not as you want it to exist in under ideal conditions. You understand the forces at play and you take those forces into account. And it's unbiased. Uh, it is equally as critical as reality itself. It doesn't judge. It looks at the world the way the world exists. And only by doing that can you analyze reality as it exists. And on that basis, you can have a scientific concept of socialism. So that will be what we get to next week. I'll stay on for a moment to see if you guys have any questions. Feel free to put them into the chat. I'll answer anything that you got. Um, but if not, we'll leave the next volume up for next week and see where we end up. Like I said, this is a great introduction into socialism. Uh, Marx and Engels spent a lot of time. Unfortunately, they wasted a lot of time. I mean, it wasn't a waste, but they ended up putting a lot of energy into clarifying their thought because there were people in their time who had misconceptions. So they had to clarify other people's misconceptions and set them straight. And unfortunately, that kind of stuff is necessary to make sure that people have a clear and solid understanding on which to move forward. And for that, we should be thankful because it is strenuous and tedious work to have clear ideas to base our understandings off of. It's not easy. And that is the work that we do today. You don't learn any of this in school. We do not have any of these teachings in school. We don't learn to look at history under material conditions. We don't learn to process information dialectically. But the only reason we have a theory of relativity was because of dialectical reasoning. You don't go from Newtonian physics to the theory of relativity without thinking dialectically. You have to understand that things are in a constant state of change in order to reason out the theory of relativity. It is literally applying dialectics to physics. You it is you literally cannot come to that conclusion without having an understanding of dialectics. So it makes perfect sense that Albert Einstein was a socialist. You literally have to be in order to make progress in science. In order to drive science farther, you need to have this level of reasoning ability. It's yeah, but I'll leave it there, and hopefully this is yeah, hopefully you this is ringing true, and we'll see. I mean, the next chapter is on dialectics, so hopefully it'll add some clarity to some of what we've uh, already read through and keep pressing forward. But uh, we'll end it there, and we'll see each other next week. Bye, guys.